Last week, we learned a lot about the style of the campaign our friends across the aisle plan on waging. More importantly, we learned a lot about the substance of the foreign policy of George Bush has been pursuing, and that John McCain has made clear he will continue. The first thing that last week reveals, in my view, is an emerging ugly pattern of political attacks masquerading as policy. It started last month when Senator McCain said, and I quote, "I think it's very clear who Hamas wants to be the next president of the United States of America." So apparently is Danny Ortega and several others, continuing the quote. If Senator Obama is favored by Hamas, I think people can make their judgments accordingly. His surrogates repeated the charge. I've known John and been John's friend for over 30 years. And I have to tell you, I'm going to get in trouble with Democrats. I didn't think John would say something like that. I didn't think John would engage in the very kind of tactics that were used so successfully against him by President Bush. And then last week, President Bush unleashed, which I expected, a long-distance swift-boat attack on Senator Obama and Democrats, and doing it, as John said, in the Knesset, in the Israeli Knesset. The White House has long ago perfected the art of stringing together sentences or paragraphs that read in isolation actually might make some sense, but when read together, send a very, very different message. In the space of 3 paragraphs, President Bush cited the outrageous statements of the Iranian leaders with regard to Israel. Then he said, some believe we should negotiate with terrorists and radicals. And then he invoked an American senator in 1939 who said that talking with Hitler might have, had he had a chance to talk with Hitler, that we may have been able to prevent World War II. And he tied it up in a very neat bow, talking about the false comfort of appeasement. Then the White House, according to the press, the White House told the press on background that the remarks that he made, in case they missed it, were references to calls by Senator Obama and other Democrats to engage Iran, only to say later on the record that that was not their intention whatsoever. Karl Rove must be very proud. In his absence, he must be very proud. They've learned his lessons well. What is stunning is that this is the only president I know of, and I've been here for 7, but I've been researching, trying to figure out ever. I don't have a definitive answer, but in the 7 with whom I've served, this is the only president who would engage and has engaged in this kind of activity overseas. It's disheartening that John McCain seized upon, appearing to have been coordinated with the White House, a man I admire, seized upon and endorsed President Bush's remarks instead of repudiating them. The president's remarks reveal a man totally out of touch with his own government, totally, completely out of touch with what he himself has authorized, and totally out of touch with a long bipartisan position of Democrat and Republican presidents on how to conduct our foreign policy. The day before the president spoke, his own Secretary of Defense called for engaging Iran. I will not take the time to read the quote. His Secretary of State has repeatedly called for engaging and sitting down with Iran. The president himself authorized diplomats to meet with their Iranian counterparts about Iraq. And he struck a deal with Libya through actually direct discussions, not him personally, but direct discussions at the highest level with Gaddafi. I got a call from the White House telling me Air Force 2 was waiting at Andrews Air Force Base several years ago. Would I please fly to Libya for a personal meeting with Gaddafi? They, I suspect, needed cover for what they were doing was the right thing. This is the President of the United States who addresses Kim Jong-il as "Dear Mr. Chairman," who has a gifted diplomat in North Korea now negotiating one-on-one with Kim Jong-il. Folks, if you're going to have a list of the top 10 terrorists in the world and those who sponsor it, it'd be awful hard to have kept Gaddafi or Kim Jong-il off that list. The president was right to engage Libya. The president was correct to engage North Korea, just as his cabinet officials are right to want to engage Iran. Just like President Nixon and Reagan were right to engage the Chinese and the Soviets. But the president was absolutely dead wrong to launch a political attack from abroad. And John McCain was wrong to support it. It's disappointing, and it's clearly beneath the presidency. I believe that the damage done was not to Barack Obama, but to American credibility. Imagine the conversations going on from Paris to Tokyo in the offices of the heads of state with whom we have to deal. You have to ask yourself, what can explain this policy, this pattern that's emerging, masquerading as a policy? I believe there are multiple purposes. I don't know for certain. I can't get inside the mind of the president, or in this case, my friend John. But it sure seems on the surface it's to hide the failure of a foreign policy that Bush has pursued, weakening us more than any president has in modern history in our place in the world, and hide the fact that John McCain continues to adhere to the essence of the policy, this failed policy being pursued by Bush. And I think it has a second purpose, to distract the American people with the politics of smear and fear in the hope that that's what we'll be focusing on. I'm equally convinced it will not work because the failure of this administration is so patently obvious to the American people, so overwhelmingly clear to the American public and to the world, that you cannot gloss over it with these political attacks. Under George Bush, on George Bush's watch, Iran, not freedom, has been on the march in the Middle East. Iran is much closer to a nuclear bomb than they were when he became president 7 years ago. Iran's influence in Iraq is expanded, not diminished. Iran's terrorist proxy Hezbollah is ascendant in Lebanon, in a country that is on the brink of a civil war. Beyond Iran, al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan, where they actually live and where they reside, and we know where they are, the very people who perpetrated the attack on 9/11 are stronger than they were, according to our intelligence community, than they were before 9/11. Hamas controls Gaza and launches rockets into Israel every day. 140,000 American troops remain stuck in Iraq with no one in sight after over 4,000 deaths and over 30,000 injuries. And a commitment that's going to bind us to well over $1 trillion, closer to $2 trillion. Because of the policy George Bush has pursued and John McCain will continue, the entire Middle East is more dangerous than it was the day they came to office. And the United States and our allies, including Israel, are less secure. Last week, John was very clear. He ruled out talking with Iran. He said that Senator Obama was naive and inexperienced for advocating engagement. He asked the question, what is it that he wants to talk about? If John can't answer that question, if John cannot answer that basic question, then we are in real trouble were he to become President of the United States of America.